There's a moment, and I've heard soldiers describe it, diplomats too, even a few scientists who have worked the outer stations, where you realize the thing across the table from you isn't playing the same game you are. Not a different version of the game, not a variation with modified rules. A completely different game. Darian Voss thought he understood that moment. He'd been in 18 first contact negotiations. He'd sat across from the Keth Morin delegation when they arrived smelling of methane and copper, their three mouths speaking simultaneously in harmonics that made human ears bleed if you weren't wearing dampeners. He'd handled the Gorvai crisis in 2341, when the entire outer belt nearly went dark because someone in Ambassador Chen's office had misread a territorial coordinate by 4 decimal points. He thought he'd seen everything the galaxy had to offer in the way of unexpected. He had not met Seraphine Vale. Chapter 1: The Briefing. The Meridian Compact Station hung in the gravitational null point between Earth's moon and the L4 asteroid cluster, which sounds poetic until you actually have to live there for 6 months. Then it's just a spinning metal drum with recycled air that always smells faintly of someone else's dinner. I know this because I spent 14 months on Meridian before the Vale delegation arrived. My name is Corporal Theo Hargrove, and I want to be clear up front that I am not the hero of this story. I was there. I watched most of it happen. I helped clean up some of the aftermath. But Darian Voss is the one who walked into that negotiation thinking he could charm his way through it. And what happened to him, what she did to him, what he let her do, that's the story. I'll tell it as straight as I can. The briefing happened on a Tuesday. Station time, which means nothing to anyone who hasn't lived through the particular madness of trying to maintain a 24-hour cycle when you're rotating at 0.7 revolutions per minute in a location that has no sun. Commander Reyes called the senior staff into conference room 4, which we called the fishbowl because of the curved transparent wall that looked out into the main docking corridor, and she pulled up the file. The Vale Collective, she said, and her voice had that particular flatness that meant she'd been reading reports for 16 hours and had run out of the capacity for inflection. 17 systems. Estimated population, 4.2 billion. Technology rating, she paused, tapped her tablet, frowned at it the way you frown at something that doesn't make sense. Technology rating is marked as conditional. Someone asked what that meant. It means, Reyes said, that the assessment team couldn't figure out a clean category. Their propulsion is approximately 2 centuries ahead of ours. Their computing architecture doesn't map to anything we've cataloged, but their medical technology is. Another pause, another frown, listed here as pre-industrial. The room did the thing rooms do when something doesn't add up. A kind of collective stillness, everyone quietly processing, nobody wanting to be the first to say that doesn't make sense because maybe everyone else understood something they didn't. Pre-industrial, said Darian Voss from the back of the room. He said it like he was tasting the words. He had this habit of letting silence work for him, sitting back in his chair, slightly apart from whatever group he was in, voice pitched just low enough that everyone had to lean slightly toward him to hear it. He was good-looking in the way that negotiators sometimes are. Not dramatically, not distractingly, but in a way that made people want to keep looking at him, keep giving him their attention. Dark hair, serious eyes, the kind of jaw that communicated I have thought about this situation from every angle and I'm not panicking. They're faster than us by 2 centuries and they haven't invented antibiotics. We don't know what they've invented, Reyes said. We know what they use. The assessment team's medical officer reported that the Vale don't appear to use any pharmaceutical treatments, any surgical procedures, or any diagnostic equipment. They also reported that the Vale don't appear to get sick. Another silence. That's Voss started. I know, Reyes said. That's not. I know. He leaned back, let it sit. What else? Lifespan, unknown. The assessment team noted that the eldest member of the delegation they encountered identified herself as having participated in a treaty negotiation in the year 1847. They assumed this was a calendrical difference. They ran the conversion. It wasn't. She set the tablet down. She was talking about Earth year 1847, by our calendar. No one said anything to that. They eat, someone asked eventually. Reyes looked at the questioner for a long moment. Not in any way we've been able to document. The assessment team observed them in close quarters for 11 days. No food consumption, no water consumption. They did observe, and I'm quoting here, a marked preference for close physical proximity to warm-blooded crew members, particularly during low-light hours. Darian Voss put his pen down. I watched him do it. It was one of those small movements that contains a whole calculation, the hand still, the pen touching the table surface, the eyes going slightly distant while the brain does something fast and private. He looked up at Reyes. Are we negotiating with vampires? He asked. Commander Reyes had the expression of someone who has been waiting for this question, and still somehow wasn't ready for it. The Veil have provided their own species designation, which translates approximately to the sustained. Our xenobiological team's current working hypothesis. Are we negotiating with vampires? Is that they represent a form of biological immortality achieved through a mechanism we don't yet fully understand, which may or may not involve the absorption of. Commander. She stopped. The Veil delegation arrives in 72 hours. You've been assigned as lead negotiator. Your pre-read package includes everything we know. She picked up her tablet again, which was the signal that the meeting was over. Which is not much. Try not to get bitten. She said that last part like a joke. I don't think she meant it entirely as one. Chapter 2, Arrival. The Veil ship came in on approach from the dark side, which our traffic controllers found unusual because that meant it hadn't been on any of our long-range scans for the 17 hours before it appeared. It just materialized, according to the official report. 1 second, empty space. The next, a vessel the color of old bone hanging in the shipping lane like it had always been there. It was smaller than I expected. I'd been on the observation deck when it came in, pressed against the transparent barrier with about 30 other station personnel, all of us trying to look casual about the fact that we were absolutely staring. The ship was maybe a third the size of one of our mid-range diplomatic vessels. Smooth. No visible thrusters, no drive exhaust, no running lights in any configuration that matched our standard docking signals. Just that pale, curved hull and a single strip of deep violet light running along what might have been its equator. It's beautiful, said someone beside me. One of the engineers from the lower decks, a woman named Prita who worked on atmospheric systems and generally had very strong opinions about things. She was the last person I'd expect to call a spacecraft beautiful. It's efficient, I said, because I didn't know what else to say. No, she said. It's beautiful, look at the geometry, there's no wasted surface. It's like, she paused, searching, like something that evolved, not something that was built. I looked at it more carefully. She was right, I thought, though I couldn't have explained why. The docking process took 4 hours. Our systems and theirs had to negotiate a connection protocol, and I mean that almost literally. Our AI spent most of that time in what our systems operators described as active dialogue with the Veil ship's intelligence, working out the handshake. When it finally sealed, the connection was so smooth you felt it more than heard it. A kind of pressure equalization, like the moment when you swallow on a descent. The delegation was 3 people. I'd expected more. Every first contact delegation we'd received had been at minimum a dozen members. Because you need support staff, translators, security, technical advisors, people to carry things. The Veil sent 3, and 2 of them looked like they were there for ornamentation. The third was Seraphine Veil. I don't have a clean way to describe her that doesn't sound like I'm either overstating it or understating it. She was tall, not remarkably, but enough. Her skin was the color of deep water, a blue-gray that caught the station's fluorescent lighting in ways human skin doesn't. Her hair was black and worn pinned up in a structure that seemed more architectural than decorative, small geometric objects threaded through it that caught the light like glass. Her eyes were, and I measured this later against photographs and against the memory of everyone I spoke to who saw her, silver. Not gray, silver, the kind of color that suggests its own illumination. She walked into the docking bay like she'd been in it 1,000 times before. Maybe she had. She was apparently over 300 years old. The welcoming committee was Commander Reyes, 3 junior diplomats, a cultural liaison, and Darian Voss. I was there in my capacity as a security escort, which mostly meant standing at a correct angle and trying not to be conspicuous. I watched Voss when Seraphine walked in. I'd worked with him for 8 months at that point, and I'd developed a decent read on his tells. He had a very good face, controlled, practiced, calibrated to project whatever he needed it to project. But there was one thing he couldn't quite control, which was the half-second of raw reaction before the professional mask snapped into place. When Seraphine Vale walked through that docking bay door, Darian Voss's face did something I'd never seen it do. It went still. Not his professional stillness, not the measured pause he used to buy himself thinking time. Something different, something involuntary, like a system receiving input it wasn't designed to process. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the mask was back, the handshake was happening, pleasantries were being exchanged through the translator units we'd set up, and Darian Voss was being his most professionally impressive self, voice calibrated, smile present but not excessive, body language open and non-threatening. She looked at him, the way you look at something you already know the shape of. Chapter 3, the first session. The negotiation was about a trade corridor, or at least, that's what it was officially about. The Vale had shipping routes that passed through 3 systems the Meridian Compact claimed jurisdiction over. We wanted regulated transit agreements. They apparently wanted something, though the assessment team had been unable to determine exactly what. The first session was in Conference Room 2, which was bigger than the fishbowl and had actual plants in it. Someone had decided that natural elements made a good diplomatic impression, so there were 3 large planters of engineered greenery along the south wall, and the lighting had been adjusted to something warmer than standard station fluorescence. It looked, Voss had said in his pre-session briefing, like someone's idea of what a negotiation room should look like if they'd only ever seen them in old films. He wasn't wrong. Seraphine arrived 11 minutes after the session was scheduled to begin. Her 2 companions took seats along the wall, behind and to her left, and said nothing for the entire 3 hours. She sat directly across from Voss. The translator units were embedded in the table's small circular devices that generated a localized field, so there was no visible equipment, just a slight shimmer in the air between them when either spoke. I stood near the door. I wasn't supposed to be listening actively, but the room wasn't that big. Voss opened with his standard approach, establish common ground, acknowledge the historical weight of the moment, signal respect for the other party's civilization, without being obsequious about it. He was very good at this. I'd watched him do it with species that communicated through bioluminescence and species that considered sustained eye contact a declaration of war. He always found the register. With Seraphine, though, something was slightly off. Not wrong, not bad, just off, like a musician playing a piece they know perfectly well but in a room with unusual acoustics. She listened to his opening with an expression that wasn't quite polite attention and wasn't quite amusement, something between them or behind them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You have done this many times," she said. The translator made her voice slightly flatter than it probably was, but something of the original texture came through anyway. Low, unhurried. 18 first contact negotiations, Voss said, though I prefer to think of each one as unique. You prefer to think of each one as unique, she repeated, and it wasn't mocking, it was considering, like she was holding the sentence up to the light. But you use the same approach. A pause. Adaptations are made based on. You opened with an acknowledgement of historical significance. You expressed respect for our civilization's duration. You invited reciprocal respect by mentioning your own experience without claiming superiority. These are moves. She said the word cleanly, not accusatory. Just accurate. They are well-executed moves, but they are moves. Darian Voss had been in 18 first contact negotiations. He'd had his methodology dissected by alien species before. The Kethmoran were famously literal about communication strategy, and the Gorvai had essentially written a paper analyzing his approach during their crisis talks. He was used to having his technique observed. But there was something about the way she said it, like she wasn't critiquing the tactic, like she was just noting that she could see it, the way you'd note that you can see the bones through an X-ray. Not good, not bad, just visible. He smiled, his good smile, the one that said, "You've surprised me and I'm going to enjoy this." "You're right," he said, "they are moves. Every communication is, to some degree. You're making moves right now, establishing that you can see my methodology, signaling that you won't be managed by it, inviting me to respond more directly. Those are also moves." She looked at him. Then, and I swear to you this is exactly what happened, because I've replayed it enough times in my head, the corner of her mouth moved, just barely, not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. "Better," she said. And Darian Voss, for the second time in my experience of him, went briefly still. Chapter 4, Off the Record. He found me in the mess hall at about 2200 station time, which was late enough that most of the day shift had cleared out, and it was just maintenance crews and the handful of insomniacs that every station accumulates over time. I was eating rehydrated noodles and reading a novel on my tablet, and trying not to think about the fact that I had a 500 shift the next day. He sat down across from me without asking, which was his habit. Voss didn't ask for things he was reasonably confident would be granted. "Tell me what you know about the Veil," he said. "I know what was in the briefing packet. I know you read it twice. You annotate things. I've seen your briefing notes." This was the thing about Darian Voss that people sometimes forgot under the charm and the professional polish. He paid attention. He watched people. Not in a creepy way, in the way that someone pays attention when they are genuinely, deeply curious about the world and the things moving through it. "I don't know anything that wasn't in the packet," I said. "What are you actually asking?" He pulled a coffee from somewhere. I hadn't seen him get it, and turned the cup in his hands, not drinking it. "What's your read on her?" I put my tablet down. "She's not what I expected," I said carefully. "That's not a read. She's precise. She notices things. She's been watching all of us since she arrived, not just you." I saw her look at the environmental controls panel in the docking bay for about 4 seconds, just a glance, the kind most people wouldn't catch, and I'd bet she knows exactly how our atmospheric recycling works now. He nodded slowly. "She's been doing it all through the session too, tracking secondary information. Where the exits are, how the ventilation flows, the translator unit's range boundaries. She's not treating this as a negotiation. She's treating it as..." He stopped. "As what?" "As reconnaissance," he said, then quieter, "or as an assessment." I thought about the way she'd walked into the docking bay, like she already knew the shape of the place. "What do the Veil actually want?" I asked. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." He drank some coffee. "The trade corridor matters, but it's not the main event. The Kethmoran wanted it for mineral rights. The Gorvai wanted it for population expansion routes. The veil, he shook his head. Every time I think I've found the thread, it's somewhere else. Maybe the thread is you, I said. He looked at me. The assessment team said they were specifically interested in a human negotiator. They requested a human-led team. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Why do you think? I think, I said, that the Veil Collective, which has 17 systems and is apparently a few centuries old and doesn't get sick and doesn't die, has probably negotiated trade corridors before. I think they know how to do it. I think this specific negotiation, this specific station, this specific team, is about something that isn't in the briefing packet. He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through his expression that I couldn't entirely name. You're smarter than your rank suggests, Hargrove. Thank you, sir. It's an observation, not a compliment. But he said it with that slight warmth that meant it was actually both. Get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. He left. I watched him go. I sat there for a while, eating cold noodles, thinking about the way Seraphine Vale had looked at him when he'd said better. Like she'd been waiting for him to say it. Like she'd been waiting for a long time. Chapter 5, Something in the Air. By the third session, people on the station had noticed something. It's hard to explain if you haven't spent time on a contained installation. A ship, a station, an isolated base. When you live in close quarters with a finite group of people, you develop a sensitivity to the social atmosphere that goes way beyond anything you'd have on the surface. Small changes register. Mood shifts propagate. Rumors don't spread so much as diffuse, the way heat diffuses through a metal surface. The rumor that diffused over those 3 days was this. The Veil delegation made people feel strange. Not bad strange. Not threatening strange. Strange like, I heard it described a dozen different ways. Like walking into a room where music had just been playing. Like the feeling before a storm, when the air pressure drops and everything goes very still and very quiet, and there's this quality of imminence to the world that you can't locate in any single thing. Like being watched by something that wasn't unfriendly. Dr. Amara Osai, our station's physician, ran a voluntary survey on the 3rd day. Low-grade physiological effects in crew members who'd had direct contact with the Veil, elevated heart rate in 7 individuals, mild euphoria in 3, 2 reported a sensation she described in her notes as heightened sensory awareness. Nothing alarming, nothing that required intervention, but enough to notice. She came to Ray's with her findings. I know this because I was walking past Ray's office when it happened, and the door wasn't fully closed. It's consistent with proximity effect, Osai said. Something they're emitting, pheromonal possibly, though nothing our instruments can isolate. Very low level. Probably unconscious on their part. Probably, Ray said. I'd recommend rotating the direct contact staff every 48 hours too. The negotiation is in its 3rd day. I'm not pulling Voss off it. A pause. He's been in direct contact with the delegation lead for 6 hours a day, if the effect is cumulative. Has Voss reported any symptoms? He hasn't filled out the survey. Right, another pause. Talk to him. Yes, ma'am. I kept walking. I found out later that Osai did talk to him, and that Voss said he was fine, and that when Osai looked at him while he was saying it, he was turning a pen in his hands in the way that, if you knew his habits, meant he was managing something he wasn't saying out loud. Chapter 6, The 4th Evening. I found the night logs later, after everything, going through the station's security archives as part of the debriefing process. So some of what I'm telling you now is from my own witness, and some of it is from that footage, and I've tried to mark which is which. On the 4th evening of the Veil delegation stay, at approximately 23:47 station time, Seraphine Vale left the guest quarters that had been assigned to her delegation. This wasn't unusual, technically. The Veil had been granted full access to the common areas of the station during their stay, and the agreement included no specific curfew. What was unusual was that she was alone, the first time any of the Vale had been observed outside their quarters without the full three-person group. She walked through the station like she knew where she was going. The security footage showed her moving through the lower residential corridor with a kind of ease that didn't match the layout. She made no wrong turns, didn't slow at intersections, didn't reference any signage. She'd been in those corridors once on the initial tour 2 days before. She remembered. She stopped outside a door and waited. The door was Darian Voss's quarters. She didn't knock, she just stood there. And then, 43 seconds later, the door opened. I don't know how he knew she was there. The motion sensor log shows she hadn't knocked, hadn't used the comm panel. He just opened the door. In the footage, you can see his face when the door opens. The brief flash of something before the professional response activates. Then he said, and this is from the audio log which I had access to in the debrief, "I wondered if you'd do this." And she said, "I know." Chapter 7, The Conversation. I wasn't in the room. I want to be clear about that. Everything I know about what passed between them in those next 2 hours comes from 2 sources. The official debrief testimony Voss gave afterward, and what he told me personally later in a conversation I'll get to in part 2. So this is reconstructed. It's my best attempt at an honest reconstruction. I've tried not to add things that weren't there. She came in. He offered her a seat, which she took with the particular quality she had of making everything seem slightly more deliberate than the action warranted. The quarters were small, they always were, on a station, a narrow room with a fold-down desk, a bed, a viewport that looked out into the shipping lane where her ship still hung, that pale bone color against the stars. "You should be asleep," she said. "So should you," he said, "if that's something you do." "We do," she said. "It looks different than your sleep, perhaps, but we rest." He asked what it looked like. "Still," she said, "very still. We can remain that way for a long time, centuries if necessary." A pause. "We've done that. When there was nowhere to go and nothing to do, and the station we lived in was damaged beyond immediate repair. We waited. In the dark. In the dark." He thought about that. He said later that it was one of the first moments where the actual reality of what she was, not the briefing packet version, not the diplomatic category, but the fact of it, centuries of lived experience, darkness and waiting and time stretching out past anything a human mind could comfortably hold, landed on him. Not as information, as weight. "Is that why you're here?" he asked. "The corridor negotiation isn't." "No," she said. "That's real, we need the corridor, but it isn't the primary reason." "Then what is?" She looked at him. Silver eyes in the dim light of his quarters, that pale ship visible through the viewport behind her. "We've been watching Earth for a long time," she said. "A very long time. We've watched your civilizations rise. We watched Rome. We were present in various capacities for several of your industrial revolutions. We found your species interesting." "Interesting?" he repeated. He had, apparently, the same response I did. "You're very short-lived," she said. "Not critically, we've encountered species with shorter spans, but you burn with a particular intensity because of it. The urgency, the way you compress meaning into small spaces of time. I find it," she paused, in the way that suggested she was finding the right word with care, "moving." "You've been watching us for how long?" "I personally have been aware of your planet since approximately your 14th century, she said. He let that land. "What do you want from this?" he asked. Not the negotiation, she could hear the distinction in his voice. "What do you want from being here?" She was quiet for a moment. The viewport lit one side of her face in faint starlight. "I want to understand," she said, "whether it's possible." "Whether what's possible?" "Whether a sustained can form a genuine bond with a brief one." She said it so simply that it took him a moment to register what she'd actually said. We have wondered about this for a very long time. Theoretically, philosophically, it's one of our oldest debates. The brief ones your kind and others like you have things we've lost: urgency, hunger, the ability to be fully, dangerously present in a single moment because you understand on some cellular level that you don't have many of them. We've been sustained too long, many of us. We've grown. She searched for the word careful. And you think I'm not careful? I think, she said, that you are very practiced at appearing careful, and that underneath it, you are one of the most urgently alive people I have encountered in a very long time. The debrief testimony doesn't include what he said to that. There's a gap in the record, technical issue, the report noted, though the timing was a little convenient. What I know is that the conversation continued for 2 more hours, and when she left, she walked back through the station the same way she'd arrived, certain of the path, unhurried. He was still awake at 400 when I passed his door on my way to the observation deck. The light under his door was on. Chapter 8: The Shift. Things changed after the 4th night. Not dramatically, nothing dramatic was visible on the surface. The negotiation sessions continued. The trade corridor language was being drafted. On paper, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. But Voss was different. I noticed it first in small things. He started arriving to the sessions early, which he hadn't been doing. He started choosing a seat that was slightly closer to her side of the table, not obviously, just by a few centimeters, but consistently. He brought coffee to every session, and on the 6th day he brought 2 cups and set one near her side of the table without comment, and she looked at it and said nothing, and didn't drink it, but didn't move it away either. He was also sleeping less. I could tell by the time stamps on his message logs. He was sending work communications at 300, 400 hours that didn't align with his established schedule. And when I saw him in the mess hall or the corridors, he had that quality that people have when something has grabbed their full attention and they can't quite let it go, present enough, functional enough, but with part of themselves occupied elsewhere. I pulled him aside on day 7. I didn't plan to. We passed each other in the corridor after the morning session, and something about the way he looked made me say, without particularly meaning to, "Are you all right?" He stopped, looked at me. "Why do you ask?" "Because you look like a man who's had an interesting few nights and hasn't quite processed them yet." He almost smiled, perceptive. "Corporal Hargrove, sir. It's literally my job to notice things." He leaned against the corridor wall, which was a more casual posture than he usually allowed himself. "She talks to me," he said, "in the evenings, after sessions." He said it like he was still working out what it meant. "We sit in the observation lounge," she founded herself, "I don't know how, and she talks about things she's seen, civilizations she's watched build and collapse, stars she was near when they went. I sit there and he stopped. "I listen. And it's the most full I've felt in years." He said it with a kind of bafflement, like he was diagnosing something he didn't quite have the right tools for. "She's not," he started, then stopped again. "Every instinct I have is telling me that she's not quite what she appears, that there are angles I'm not seeing, that I should be careful. And every other part of me just doesn't care." He looked at me for a moment. "Wants to keep listening," he said finally. I thought about what I should say. What the right thing to say was, for a man who was clearly, carefully, methodically developing feelings for an alien immortal who was technically the subject of his current diplomatic assignment, and who could probably see every move he was making before he made it. "She's old," I said eventually. "Older than anything we have a real reference for. She's watched a lot of people." "I know. She's probably very good at reading people." "I know. She might be." I stopped. "Manipulating me," he said, not defensively, just naming it. "Possibly, but for what purpose? If she wanted to compromise the negotiation, there are more efficient methods. If she wanted something from me personally, what would it be? I don't have anything of value to the Veil Collective that they can't get through normal channels. Maybe I stopped again. Maybe she's just interested, he said quietly. The way she said she was interested in humans, in the way we burn. He said the last word with a self-awareness that was almost painful to watch. Darian, I said. I didn't usually use his first name. Be careful. He looked at me. I know, he said. He didn't sound like he believed it would help. Part 2, The Bite. Chapter 9, What Burns. The negotiation was scheduled for 12 days. By day 9, the trade corridor language was essentially done. 3 more sessions could have wrapped it up. Everyone on the diplomatic team knew this. Voss knew it, which meant everyone was quietly aware that the remaining days had a different quality to them than the early sessions had. Time that was running out. I've been in enough situations to know what that does to people. There's something about a fixed ending that makes the space before it more charged, more vivid, like the last pages of a book where you're reading slower because you don't want it to end, and faster because you have to know. Voss was in both modes simultaneously. I could see it. Seraphine, characteristically, was harder to read. On day 9, after the afternoon session, I was doing a routine security walk of the common areas when I came around a corner in the observation lounge and found them there. This was unusual because the lounge was off the standard evening schedule. It was only 1700, not the late-night hours Voss had described. But they were both there, on opposite ends of a long curved bench that faced the main viewport. That viewport on the observation lounge was the best one on the station, full panoramic, the asteroid field visible in the middle distance, the Veil ship hanging in its lane, and beyond it the particular darkness that was just full of things we hadn't discovered yet. I stopped in the doorway. Neither of them looked at me, or rather, Voss didn't look at me, and Seraphine glanced at me with the perfect peripheral precision of someone who'd already been aware I was approaching from down the corridor. I started to back out, but something, I don't know what, made me stay. I found a position outside the doorway where I could hear without being visible, which is, technically, not within my duties, and I'll own that. But I was worried about him, and I wanted to understand what was happening, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. Doesn't frighten you, he was saying when I'd gotten close enough to hear. They were in the middle of something. The concept of a bond, she seemed to consider. Many things about your species don't frighten me that perhaps should. I've been watching long enough that the surprising parts have mostly sorted themselves. The concept of a bond with someone who, he paused, I could hear him choosing words with care, who won't be here. There it is, she said, gently, the thing you've been building toward for 9 days. I'm a negotiator, I build toward things. You're a human, she said. You build toward things because you have to, because the time is always, she paused, always shorter than you want it to be. How do you stand it, he asked, watching every brief thing just go. The silence that followed was long enough that I almost thought I'd missed her response. We don't always, she said finally, stand it. There's a reason many of the sustained stop forming connections with brief species. The grief is proportional but stretched. You lose one of you over the course of a very short time and the grief is sharp and concentrated. We lose ours over a long time, watching them age and diminish and disappear, and the grief is lower perhaps, but very long. And yet you're here. And yet, she agreed. Why, he asked, and I could hear underneath the negotiator's voice something much less managed. Not the collective, not the corridor, you specifically, here tonight. Why? The silence this time was different, weighted differently. Because, she said, in 643 years, you are the first brief one who has asked me what I want, not what my collective wants. Not what I represent, me. The first time in the 4th night when you asked what I personally wanted from being here. A pause. The sustained don't always, another pause longer, we don't always have someone ask. We're old. We're assumed to be self-sufficient. We're assumed to have resolved all our wants long ago. Have you? No, she said, very simply. I heard him exhale. The specific exhale of someone who has been maintaining a position for a long time and has just slightly let it down. I don't know how to do this, he said. Whatever this is, I have a very organized toolkit for managing connections with other species that I've spent 18 years building. It doesn't have a category for wanting something you know will hurt you. Yes, he said. We have a word, she said, in the Veil language for this, for wanting something brief and burning because it is brief and burning, not despite it, because of it. We have a whole philosophy around it actually, around the beauty of interacting with those who burn. It's not popular among the sustained. Many find it, I believe your word is masochistic. What do you find it? Honest, she said. And then, because I am an honest person, I will tell you that I stopped listening there. Not because the conversation ended, I don't think it did, not for a while, but because I recognized that what was happening in that room had moved beyond the reach of my security clearance or my worry or even my friendship with Darian Voss. It had moved into territory that was entirely and only theirs. I walked away. Chapter 10, Day 11. On the 11th day of the negotiation, the trade corridor language was finalized, signed in the ceremonial sense, pressed and sealed through both parties' authentication systems, and transmitted to the respective governing bodies for ratification. The job was done. The Veil were scheduled to depart the following afternoon. I found Voss at 2300, standing at the viewport in the observation lounge alone, not doing anything, not reading, not working, not on a comm, just standing there looking at the stars and that pale bone-colored ship in the dark. She told you they're leaving tomorrow, I said. This morning, he said, during the session. How did she tell you? Very directly. Seraphine is always very direct. He was quiet for a moment. She said the departure would be at 14:30. She said the corridor agreement would be formally ratified within 60 days. She said, he stopped. What? She said she hoped I would be careful. He turned the word over, which is the same thing I said to myself before I stopped being careful. I stood with him for a bit. The stars were doing what stars always do through a viewport, which is just being there, enormous and indifferent and somehow still companionable. What happens tomorrow? I asked. Tomorrow, he said, she leaves, and I write my debrief report, and then I go on to the next thing. He said it with a particular evenness that I recognized, the voice people use when they're rehearsing an acceptance they haven't actually arrived at yet. And I said. He was quiet. Darian. She asked me, he said quietly, if I wanted to see the ship. I looked at him. Before departure, tomorrow morning, she said there are things she'd like to show me that she's never shown anyone outside the sustained. He turned from the viewport. His face had that look again, the one I'd first seen when Seraphine walked into the docking bay, the half-second before the professional mask, the raw reaction he couldn't quite control. She said it would be a gift, her word, a gift. That sounds like something you should probably report to Commander Reyes, I said. I know. That sounds like something that has potential security complications I shouldn't even be able to enumerate. I know. Darian. I know, he said for the third time. And then quietly, I'm going. Chapter 11, The Ship. I'm going to tell you what he told me afterward, because I wasn't on the ship. I wasn't authorized to be on the ship, and even if I had been, I think she would have asked for him alone. It was that kind of thing. He went at 800, walked through the docking bay in civilian clothes. He'd specifically not worn his diplomatic uniform, and I noticed that and didn't say anything, and crossed the connection bridge to the Veil vessel. The interior was not what he expected. He'd expected, he said, something clinical, something that matched the efficiency of the exterior. What he found was something that felt, against all logic, old. Not deteriorated, nothing was worn or damaged. But the materials themselves were old, the way ancient stone is old, the way certain objects carry a quality of time in their substance that you can't entirely account for with visual evidence alone. The corridors were curved, lit with something that wasn't quite bioluminescence but wasn't quite mechanical either, a soft blue-violet that seemed to come from the material of the walls themselves. She met him at the entrance and took him through it slowly. The navigation chamber, which had no instruments he could identify, and a center element that looked like a dark pool of liquid suspended in midair. The rest area where the veil slept was her word, though the surfaces there looked less like beds than like places to simply become still. A chamber near the center of the ship, where something hummed at a frequency he could feel in his chest rather than hear, and which she explained was the drive, though she made no attempt to explain how it worked and he didn't ask. And then she took him to what she called the memory chamber. It was a circular room, smaller than the others, and the walls were covered in something that looked at first like texture, like relief sculpture. When she brought him closer and the light adjusted, he saw that they were images, pressed or etched or grown into the material, he couldn't tell, thousands of them, layered over centuries, tiny and incredibly detailed. "We record," she said, "everything we've seen. Everything the sustained want to carry forward." She touched one section of the wall very gently, and something shifted. The image he was looking at changed, deepened, as if she'd activated it somehow. "This section is mine," she said. He looked at it, really looked. He was there, in the images. Impressions of him, nothing photographic, not a camera's record, but something more like the way memory looks when you try to articulate it, the essential shape of a thing rather than its surface detail. The conference room, recognizable by its dimensions. The observation lounge. The viewport with the ship visible through it. She'd already put him in the memory wall. It had to have been done before today, days ago. "You knew," he said, "that you'd want to remember me." "I knew," she said, "before I arrived, from the preliminary communications. There was something in how you wrote, the particular weight of your sentences." She looked at the image. "I thought I might be wrong. I wanted to see in person." A pause. "I wasn't wrong." He stood there looking at this record of himself in the memory of a 600-year-old being, surrounded by 6 centuries of other memories, all the things she'd seen and kept, and he felt, he said, like the ground had become non-Euclidean, like the geometry of the moment was folding in ways he didn't have the math for. "What does it mean," he asked, "being in here?" "It means," she said, "that I intend to remember you on purpose, deliberately, for a very long time." She looked at him. "For my kind, this is." She searched for the right word with that particular carefulness she always used, "not small." "For my kind," he said, "this is also not small." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "There's something I would like your permission to do." He said, "All right." She stepped closer. And this is where his debrief testimony gets careful and particular, because he was telling this to Commander Reyes and 2 intelligence officers, and he was very deliberately accurate, the way people are accurate when they want the record to be correct. She was, he said, very close. Close enough that he was fully aware of everything about her that was different. The slight chill of her skin versus the warmth of his, the quality of her eyes in the ship's interior light, the way she was still in a way that his body, with its heartbeat and its breathing and its involuntary micro-movements, fundamentally wasn't. "There is a way," she said, "that the sustained can share memory, a direct transfer. It's not telepathy exactly. It's something with no good equivalent in your languages. It requires a small physical contact." A pause. "It would give you access to a selection of what I've seen. A few centuries of," she seemed to be condensing something vast into something speakable, light, sky, things worth seeing. "And what does it require?" he asked. "A bite," she said very simply. "Very small, it wouldn't harm you. You'd carry a brief mark here, she touched very lightly the side of his neck for a few days. And the memories would, she paused again, it would feel like a dream, but a real one you can keep. He was quiet for a long moment, in that ship, surrounded by her centuries. You know, he said finally, when I walked into that first session I had a whole strategy, very good strategy, 18 negotiations worth of refinement. I was going to be charming and professional and just human enough to be interesting and just diplomatic enough to be safe. He looked at her. And then you said better and the whole strategy sort of dissolved. I know, she said. I thought I could, he stopped. Laughed softly at something in the thought. I thought I could win you, like that was the dynamic, like I was going to be charming enough that you'd be impressed, like you hadn't seen 10,000 charming people across 6 centuries. I had, she said. Right, he was quiet. And instead here I am, standing in your memory room about to ask you to. You don't have to ask, she said. I'm asking you. He looked at her. May I, she said. There it was. The same question, the same care, the same directness she'd used since the first session. She had always, he realized, been asking what she wanted. She had never assumed. She just waited with that long patience of the sustained to see if he would arrive at a place where he wanted to say yes. Yes, he said. She leaned in. The bite was, he searched for words in the debrief, in every conversation we had afterward, and always arrived at the same inadequacy. Not what you'd expect. Nothing dramatic. A pressure, very brief, at the side of his neck. A sensation that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite warmth but was somewhere that had no existing name in his nervous system's catalog. And then, Chapter 12, what he saw. This part I know less well. He tried to describe it. He used different words each time, and I think that was less about imprecision and more about the fact that language is built by humans for human experience, and what he was carrying after that morning wasn't quite either. He saw sky. Not Earth sky, other skies, dozens of them, hundreds, each with their particular character. A sky that was 3 suns and a gas giant on the horizon, and the color of it was something that exists in the visual spectrum, but that he hadn't had a category for before. A sky that was 1 sun and rings, the rings cutting the horizon at an angle that made the light do things. A sky full of the particular silence of a dead world on which you are the only living thing, which is a specific silence you feel differently than any other. He saw oceans that weren't water. He saw cities and many cities, but not ours. Cities built by things that weren't human and built to accommodate needs and aesthetics and social arrangements that he had no framework for. And each one was different from the last, and each one was, in its way, remarkable. He saw the inside of a peace treaty signed in the year 1242 between 2 factions of beings he didn't have names for, and he saw the moment when it failed, 40 years later, and he saw the aftermath in the way that Seraphine had seen it, which was from the outside, watching and recording, and feeling the particular grief of the long-lived witness. He saw humans, specific humans, brief ones, people she'd encountered across the centuries and put in the memory wall. He saw them as she saw them, not romanticized, not idealized, but in their particular urgency and their particular luminosity, the way they compressed themselves into their time with a specificity she found moving. He saw them age and go, and he felt, briefly and incompletely, what it felt like to watch that from the other side. He saw, near the end of the selection she shared, a set of images that were very recent. Conference rooms, a station viewport, a figure in diplomat's clothes with dark hair and serious eyes, and a jaw that communicated I am not panicking, except that from the outside, from her angle, it communicated something more like, here is someone who is trying very hard to manage something larger than his toolkit, and doing it with a dignity that is moving. He saw himself through her eyes. The way she'd put him in the memory wall wasn't small. He understood that now. He came back to himself, whatever back meant after that, in the same spot in the memory chamber, still standing, the ship quiet around him. She was a step away, watching. "Are you all right?" she asked. He thought about the question for a long moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I think I need to." He looked at her. "I think that's going to take a while to sort through." "Yes," she agreed. "I came in here thinking I understood what I was feeling," he said. "About you, about this. And now I'm not sure I had the right scale for any of it." "The brief ones often have that experience," she said. "When we share memory, the scale is different. We've had longer to," she searched for it, "longer to understand how large everything is." "Is it always overwhelming?" "Often," she said, "but not in a way that damages, in a way that expands." She looked at him, those silver eyes. "You're more than you were before." He touched the side of his neck, where the mark was. "How long?" 3 days, she said. "Then it fades." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "I don't want to make this harder than it already is, but I need to ask." "Ask." "When you go," he started. "Yes," she said before he finished. He stopped. "You don't know what I was going to say." "I know," she said. "And yes, whatever form it takes, yes." She looked at him. "The sustained have always found ways to remain in contact with those worth remaining in contact with. It is slower and imperfect, and it requires patience on both sides, but it's possible." A pause. "If you want it." "I want it," he said, no hesitation. She looked at him for a long time. 600 years of looking at brief, burning things. "I know," she said softly. "I've been waiting for you to be sure." Chapter 13, Departure. The departure was scheduled for 14:30, which I know because I was standing in the docking bay at 14:30, along with Commander Reyes and the senior diplomatic staff, and the handful of station crew who'd found reasons to be nearby. She came through the connection bridge with her 2 companions at exactly 14:30. Seraphine was always exactly on time. It was one of her qualities that Reyes had noted approvingly in her session logs. There's a particular kind of precision that comes from having done things for a very long time and having lost all patience for imprecision. She stopped in the docking bay for the formal farewell. Reyes said the words. The cultural liaison said the words. Seraphine responded through the translator, and even filtered through that slight electronic shimmer. Her voice carried its original weight. Then she looked at Voss. He was standing slightly apart from the group, which was his habit. He'd been quiet all morning, I'd seen him at breakfast, and he'd been carrying that particular inward quality he'd had since coming back from the ship. Not sad, exactly. Something more complex than sad. Something that needed a word that didn't quite exist. She walked toward him. Not far, just close enough to speak without the translator, because by this point they'd been speaking at near range often enough that both of them had managed some functional comprehension of the other's base language. Not fluency, but comprehension. She said something. I was close enough to hear it, but she said it in Vale, not in the translated register, so I didn't understand the words. He understood enough of it. He said, in the fragment of her language he'd picked up, something that I also couldn't fully parse, something short, something that I think was the Vale equivalent of I know, because that was the phrase she'd been teaching him quietly over those evenings. The phrase she used most. She looked at him for one long moment, silver eyes in the station's fluorescent light. Then she turned and walked through the bridge, and the ship sealed behind her. The departure was clean. The ship uncoupled without incident, moved out of the docking lane with that inhuman smoothness it had arrived with, and within 20 minutes was simply somewhere else. Not in the shipping lane, not on any of our scans. Somewhere. Voss stood in the docking bay for a while, after everyone else had drifted away. I waited with him a few steps back, not intruding, just there. After a long time he turned around. There was something on his face that I'd never seen on him before, not the managed composure, not the professional warmth, not the controlled charm. Something raw and real and precisely itself. something that had stopped performing. She bit me, he said, almost conversationally. I know, I said. I let her. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then she showed me 6 centuries of things. He stopped, shook his head. Not like he couldn't describe it, like the description required a space he hadn't built yet. It's a lot to carry. Yeah. It's a gift, though. He touched his neck briefly. She said it was a gift. Is it? He thought about it. Really thought, standing there in the emptying docking bay with the lights going back to their standard intensity now that the ceremony was over, and the day was resuming its ordinary shape. Yeah, he said finally, it is. We walked back through the station together, through the docking corridor and the main passage, and up toward the administrative level where both our offices were. The station was doing what stations do, maintaining itself, cycling its air, keeping its temperature, going about the enormous continuous work of keeping 30,000 people alive in a place that is inherently hostile to their existence. I thought about what she'd said about brief ones, about the urgency, about burning. I thought about what he'd seen in those borrowed centuries of memory, the specific quality she'd found in him, in us, the way we compressed meaning into the small spaces we had, the way we burned because we had to. I thought about how she'd been watching since 1847, and how of all the things in the centuries she'd seen, she'd chosen to put him in the memory wall before she arrived. What happens now? I asked. Now, he said, I write a debrief that is simultaneously completely truthful and deeply inadequate to what actually happened. He paused. And then I wait to hear from her. She said they have ways, long ways, slow ways, but ways. You'll wait. He looked at me with something that was closer to peace than anything I'd seen on his face in 11 days. I've learned something about waiting, he said, from someone who's very good at it. Epilogue: what I know. 6 months later, on a Tuesday station time, still meaningless, Darian Voss received a communication from the Vale Collective's diplomatic channel. It was encrypted in a format our systems had never seen before and decoded using a key that, as far as anyone could determine, he'd had memorized since before the communication arrived. I know this because I happened to be in the communications office when it came in, and I saw his face when they handed it to him. The same face, the half-second before the mask. He read it in private. I don't know what it said. He didn't tell me and I didn't ask. But for 3 days after he received it, he had that particular quality about him, that inward, occupied thing, like part of him was somewhere else, somewhere with different sky, somewhere with 3 suns and rings on the horizon and the particular silence of a world that has been watched for centuries by patient eyes. The mark on his neck had faded, as she'd said it would. He carried everything else. The Trade Corridor Agreement was ratified 63 days after the Vale delegation departed. It opened up a shipping lane that, within 2 years, became one of the most economically significant routes in the Outer Compact. The Kethmoran used it for mineral transport. The Gorvai expanded their population routes through it. A dozen species Claude had never been briefed about started showing up in our traffic control logs, moving through our space with the calm familiarity of people who'd been waiting for the door to open. Seraphine Vale had been right. The corridor mattered. But it wasn't the main event. I've thought about that over the years since, about what the main event actually was. Whether it was a negotiation strategy, use the charm and patience of a very old being to build a genuine connection with a human diplomat, achieve the corridor agreement as a secondary benefit, walk away with something more valuable than transit rights. I don't think so. I don't think that's what happened. I think she was there for the same reason she said she was. Because she'd been watching for 6 centuries and she'd learned that some things are worth the grief they'll eventually cause. Because the brief ones burn and the sustained have forgotten how to burn, and sometimes, rarely, deliberately, With full knowledge of the cost, you can hold something brief and burning and be warmed by it. She came in expecting to be careful. She saw Darien Voss and decided not to be. He thought he could win her heart. Instead, she bit him and gave him 6 centuries of sky.